Media engines inside these GPUs. This is something that you don't see gamers talk about or in the gaming reviews, but media engines for creators, arguably one of the most important things that you can actually come across. And why is that? Well, the media engines are different from any other part of the GPU. You've got some like RT cores, you've got some CUDA cores, or other shader units, what AMD calls. And then there's media engines. They're probably the smallest part in the GPU, but those media engines give you hardware acceleration playback on certain video codecs. And they're completely different from NVIDIA to AMD to Intel, and different generations of GPUs will have different encoders, and they make a huge difference. This is where the 50 series made the biggest leap for video editors, because if you look at the 3D rendering performance, there's not that much of a difference between 50 and 40 series, but in video editing, certain workflows, huge difference. This is not AI. It's time your CPU is not the bottleneck anymore. MSI Radeon A18HX featuring the AMD Ryzen 9 9955HX 3D processor with 16 performance cores and 144 megabytes of second-gen AMD 3D V-Cache technology. Not just the world's fastest mobile gaming processor, but also a great workhorse for creators. It's for those with extreme performance needs and no compromises. MSI Overboost Ultra technology delivering 175 watts of graphics power to the RTX 5090 plus additional 85 watts to the AMD Ryzen 9 9955HX 3D processor. That's a 260 watt total portable power. And the CPU allows full overclocking for the enthusiasts. Plenty of I/O including 2 USB 4 ports, full-size SD card reader, and an RJ45 port. 18-inch mini LED 4K display with 120Hz and display HDR 1000. Gen 5 NVMe with a dedicated heat pipe for cooling. Whether gaming, creating, or AI workloads, it delivers in all fronts. Check out more information in the description below, as well as our full video on this laptop. Thanks AMD and MSI for sponsoring this part of the video. So then, talking about these AMD media engines, apparently those 9000 series have 2 media engines inside. In terms of codec support, it's actually quite poor. They don't support 10-bit photo 2 like we can see on NVIDIA or Intel media engines, so that's not so impressive. But at the same time, H.264 codec playback or long GOP actual encoding, they are very, very fast. But there's a little bit of an asterisk where we have to talk about encoding quality. Now, you might be hearing me talk about encoding and decoding. If you're new here, let me explain what that means. Encoding means putting video together. So let's say you've got your video timeline and then you want to export it out. That means now you're encoding video. You're putting the video, making it into a different format. Decoding video, like decoding or decrypting, algorithm, you have to decode or playing that video back because the video has been recorded with certain compression rate and certain file, but now you have to decode that what's been written, and then that's video playback decoding. Very, very different, and different media engines support different things. For you as a video editor, there's a huge difference between a timeline playback and exporting video. So sometimes if someone just shows you benchmark of, yeah, this exports video faster than the other one, that is not really the full actual performance review of what this codec can do, because I would argue that timeline playback is a lot more important than actual exporting speed. Because if you're editing on the timeline, you need it to be snappy, you want it to be fast when you're working with it, because you can actually go and make a cup of coffee or tea when you're exporting the video, whereas you can't do that when you're editing the video. So very different and very important depending on your workflow. So there's hardware and software playback. When the hardware on the GPU media engines can play back the codec, whether encoding or decoding, that's what we call hardware acceleration. There's special hardware inside those devices that can accelerate it and make it very, very fast. If it's software playback, what happens then with the coding or exporting, for example, or playback, is now your CPU cores, the cores that calculate everything else in your PC, they will take over and they try to play back this footage. Now, if you're an AMD Threadripper, for example, try playing back H.265 10-bit 422 footage, press play, and then you'll see all of your cores suddenly pump up, and then it's just horrendous. Sometimes the RTX 5050 that's over here, that can play back footage a lot faster than AMD 96 core Threadripper, just because it's got hardware, little tiny thing that only takes a couple of watts, compared to hard Threadripper that pulls 350 watts, is not going to do as good of a job as this 5050. That's the magic of having hardware accelerated playback. But it depends which codec you're using, because not every single codec is hardware accelerated. There's a huge codec difference between different codec and what you're using. If you're using Blackmagic RAW cinema cameras, Red RAW, Sony RAW, H.264 and 5 codecs, and this is where things get very confusing. You think that just one CPU is best for all the stuff for video editing in Premiere Pro, but actually that's not the case at all. Codecs are the ones that make the biggest difference. In large scale, there are 3 different types of codecs, and I'd like to explain this to you so you would know what you are using in your workflow and how does that affect the hardware, because the CPUs kind of play and act differently depending on the codec you're using. Firstly, I want to talk about intra-frame codecs, and they're the codecs like DNX, ProRes, and if you're using mirrorless camera, they can be named differently. For Sony, for example, it's called XAVC-SI, and that I means intra-frame. And then Canon, Lumix, they might have slightly different naming for this, but intra-frame codec means that it's a video and each frame is separately recorded. This is what you thought video is like. It's basically just taking JPEGs, except lower quality, each frame 24 frames per second, and then when you play back, you're playing back each frame. You pause it, you just process the frame, and then you keep going. It's very straightforward. Now, the benefit of interframe is that it's a bit easier to work with long GOP, which we'll get to in a minute, but the file sizes are big because it has to store each frame separately. It captures the frame, captures the frame, captures the frame. Never mind what happens in the frames, every single frame is recorded separately, so the file sizes are a little bit larger than long GOP. And it's also easier to play back with because we can play back each frame separately, and it doesn't need to look at other frames when playing it back. It's quite straightforward process, so it's easier on your hardware. Secondly, the most popular codec what you will see out there is the long GOP codecs. This means a long group of pictures. Now imagine the same frames, but the codec stores them differently. It looks at each single frame and then looks what moves in the frame. Let's say you have a shot of this, what you see right now. All the background, nothing changes in there unless I put my hands down there. And that means that instead of storing all of the pixel data all around me and in front of me, it knows that that doesn't change between these frames. So why don't we just store it in the first frame, but delete it from the other frames, but then store all the other data that gets moved within the frames. So the actual picture gets stored long group of pictures. So in order to figure out the frame kind of in the middle, it has to look at some frames before and after to figure out what that frame is. So the benefit of that is that the file sizes are a lot smaller. It's compressed because it looks at the frames differently, just like that. The downside for that is that it's very hard to play back, because whenever you pause the video and press play or go back, the hardware has to look at not just one picture to actually give you a picture on the screen. It has to look at some of these before and after to figure out what that is in there. That's called decoding or playing back the footage. So when you're on your timeline working with the video, the decoding of long group of pictures is very demanding on your hardware. Long group of picture codecs are the likes of H.264 and 5 or AV1. There are different wrappers for the codec. So for example, when you're looking on your Sony camera, it doesn't tell you that it's a H.264 or 5 codec. You might be looking at XAVC-S, XAVC-HS, something like that. So this is basically a wrapper for the codec. Once you play that in your computer and go properties, you can see whether it's H.264 or 5. AV1 is another one of those codecs. It's even more compressed and even more efficiency in terms of file sizes, can be even harder to play back, if that makes sense. But at the same time, there are specific hardware built in either CPUs or GPUs, media engines, that can play back the long group of pictures very easily. Sometimes even easier than the intra-frame codecs, just because you've got dedicated hardware that just knows how to solve that algorithm or that just equation very, very fast. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then thirdly, there are raw video codecs. And the raw video codecs, imagine them as interframe. So all these pictures that have been recorded separately, but instead of it being a still image, like a JPEG on photography, it's a raw photo. So it stores raw and every single frame is separately. Whenever you pause it, it just can play back there, but it is raw. So that means that now the file sizes are extremely large. But at the same time, it can be quite easy to work with. But there's a huge but. Depends also on the resolution, because the file sizes are so large and it plays back such a lot of data, it does require a little bit more resources to actually just crunch through that data. So if you've got large resolutions of data, then having a large core count CPU will actually be better for you because it can actually play that back. SSD speeds might actually come to play for you as well if you've got a very high bitrate raw codecs, because it has to read them from the SSD. And if you've got a SATA SSD, but you've recorded it at like 1,000, 2,000, or maybe 2 gigabytes per second bitrate, or gigabits per second perhaps, then your SSD might be the bottleneck. Remember those 3 types of codecs, because you will be working with one of these codecs, and depending on your hardware, you might choose one that works best for your specific workflow. And sometimes within your workflow, you are utilizing different types of codecs. You might be recording long GOP, then you convert it over to interframe, and then you export it to long GOP again because you publish it on YouTube or somewhere else. Or you shoot raw, and then you convert it to interframe or long GOP, and then you export it to long GOP. So depending which stage your workflow you're in, you might use different codecs, and depending where you spend the most time, certain hardware might work best for you. But very importantly, what you need to know is that the codec has a much bigger impact on performance than the resolution. Sometimes people say, yeah, it can play back or edit 8K footage. And I would argue, I can give you 1080p footage that it would struggle, but then 8K footage that would be very, very smooth, just because you've got hardware acceleration for that specific codec. So codec is more important than resolution, and not everything is hardware accelerated. Congratulations, if you've reached this part of the video, you're in the top 13% of people's attention graph, and there's more than 50% chance that you seeing this means you're not subscribed. So consider subscribing, hitting that bell icon, liking the video. It would mean a world to us. If you'd like to get detailed access to our internal benchmark database of CPUs, GPUs, SSDs, and so on for creators, then may I invite you to sign up to our newsletter, where we send out relevant information a couple of times a month when there is information. I'm not interested in flooding your inbox. This is when there is good information to share for your creative workflow, then we'll send those emails out. And also you'll get the most exclusive access to some of the behind the scenes, perhaps even giveaways. So scan that QR code or link in the description below. If you've got any urgent questions to me personally, you can always reach out on Minect. I'll always get back to my messages. If you're looking for a new hoodie, may I recommend this one. This is not just any cheap random hoodie. This is a high quality hoodie that you can get. And when purchasing this, we get a small little kickback to help us build what we're building here. My passion is to help creators choose the best tech for their workflow and help them save some money in the process. This is Tech Notice, and if you've reached this part of the video, you have been upgraded to the top 5% of the people who ever see this part. And now YouTube thinks that you'll like this video, and if you haven't subscribed, you can do it on this side. Thanks very much guys for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.